So I've been working as a forest entomologist for over 30 years. And when I first started in grad school, we really had no idea that anything like this would ever happen. This is a very, it's like, and I think to the profession in general, this has been a real wake-up call. It's sort of like the Dutch elm disease was sort of like that. But there's just a fraction of elms out there as compared to ash. This is a real game changer, not only in our urban environments, but also in the natural world, especially New York State. New York State, we probably have more ash than any other state in the nation. It's a big deal. There's a lot of issues. So basically, I'm just going to talk about the biology and then I want to sort of go through some of my thoughts about the impacts that the emerald ash borer will have in New York State. So if I can get this to work, which it's not. Okay. Then I'll just do it this way. So there it is. It's a very beautiful bug. There's no question about it. It's not very big. If you haven't never seen it before, please go back into the display over here. There's actual bugs there. We're getting
the bugs out.
We're getting the bugs out. Oh, geez, thanks. Okay. So it's a very beautiful bug. Once you see it, it'll be indelibly etched in your mind, and I can guarantee you will see it at some point in time. The life cycle is actually pretty simple as far as bugs go. You can have a 1-year or a 2-year life cycle. That means it takes 1 year for it to develop totally, or it takes 2 years for it to develop totally. The thing that's interesting about this bug is it has no obligatory diapause, is what we say. So when it gets down south into Georgia or something, we could maybe see 2 generations a year, which will be very exciting. But basically, the 1-year life cycle is what I'm going to cover. So in the springtime, it'll emerge, and you'll see the typical D-shaped exit hole, okay? This is to the genus Agrylus, the flat-headed borers. The D-shaped exit hole is also made, if you see it in a birch tree, it's the bronze birch borer. If you see it in an oak tree, it's the two-line chestnut borer. In an ash tree, it's emerald ash borer, and that's when I want you to pay attention. Okay, so the adult comes out. The female will then feed on leaves. You can see these where it's been feeding on the leaf to mature her ovaries. So a week, 2 weeks of feeding to get her ovaries mature. Then she'll lay probably up to about 100 eggs. Of course, it varies. The eggs are very small, very difficult to see, and she lays them in cracks in the bark. Okay, and that's really important when you consider you got this little teeny tiny larvae, and what does it do? It bores through the bark and into the tree. How does it do that? It needs to jam its head in between into a crevice where it uses then pneumatic pressure to get its mouth parts to get so it sort of jams its head in there. Then it uses pneumatic pressure to expand the head capsule, and then it can get its mouth parts biting into the wood. So it goes straight down into the phloem tissue, the inner bark. Okay, there's where it got in, and then it continues to grow through the season until it becomes a larvae, a late instar larvae, and then in wintertime, it'll go actually to pupate. It goes into the wood. That's the problem. It'll go about a ½ inch into the wood, and then for some reason it bends over by itself like that. We have absolutely no idea why. That's the problem. You can strip off all the bark on the tree, and you'll still have the larvae, the pupae, or the pre-pupae and the pupae in the wood. And we think that's probably how it got to the United States, where we had wood packing materials shipped in to the Detroit area. And it's actually an interesting story. I was giving a talk in Niagara County, and at the end of the talk, a fellow comes up to me sort of sheepishly and says, "Well, Mark, I think I brought that in." And so I'm thinking, okay, well, tell me your story. And he says, "I'm a retired automotive engineer, worked all my life in the Detroit area, and sure enough, right about in the early 90s is when we started bringing in tons of auto parts from China." Now, this comes from China, okay, or from Eastern Asia. But there, the native ash trees are unaffected. It's like, native insects, they actually are very valuable in the habitat in the native forest because they actually take out the weak individual, sort of like a lion chasing after the herd of antelope. It takes out the weak one, and so the population in general is actually bettered. by having the weak ones taken out. So that's what happens in Asia with the emerald ash borer. It takes out the weak individuals, but the strong trees, they survive. Well, green ash is a beautiful tree, and they planted it in Eastern Asia as a street tree. Well, green ash is native to North America, and it became infested, and they died. And they probably made packing crates, waste not, want not, make packing crates out of that material and shipped it over here. That's the scenario that I think might have happened. We have absolutely no idea exactly what happened. So anyway, then it pupates in the springtime and then emerges. That's a very simple one-year life cycle. There's the larvae of the emerald ash borer. You can tell it from the native Neoclitus, the red-headed ash borer. The red-headed ash borer has a fat head. The emerald ash borer has a small head. But the thing is about the genus Agrylus, the bronze birch borer, and the two-line chestnut borer as well, is that they have these nested bells towards the back of the larvae. It's a very good diagnostic character. So when you're peeling through your ash trees and you see larvae like that, you should immediately be aware that that could be emerald ash borer. I would send it to somebody anyway, no matter what it is. So I'm going to go through give you an idea of how fast this thing is getting around. In January 2003, they just completed basically the first surveys of the Detroit area when they determined that emerald ash borer was the problem, was the cause of all the mortality of ash in the area. And you see, they started in 2002, they saw it was a problem. Then in 2003, they realized it was a big problem. It had already spread over quite a bit large area. 2004, more detections were showing up down here in Ohio. 2005, 2006, see it already spread up here into Milwaukee. And these detections, so every time it's been detected, it's actually been there a long time. It takes a long time for the ash borer to get going in an area, the populations to get big enough for trees actually to show signs and symptoms. 2006, this was nursery stock being moved around. Are we going in the right direction? 2009. Okay, 2009 is when we first got it in New York. It was first detected in New York, I should say. 2010. So now we have it 2013, okay, all the way out here in Colorado. So that looks like one heck of a large area, right? And it is. But in reality, we're just at the very beginning of the emerald ash borer in the United States. Consider here, Ohio, where it's been a long time. This is old data, it's 2012, but still, you get an idea that it's not all over the place. And if you look at ash as well, there's a lot of ash all over the eastern seaboard. Here in New York, we have concentration, but still the ash forests are not generally involved. I mean, it's all over the place, but a very small portion of the forests are actually infested right now. And if you look at New York State, it looks like a lot here, but these are just detections that are sort of like drawing connecting the dots on these areas. We still probably have 95% of our forests uninfested. So now's the time really to pay attention to what's going on. Okay, so this is what it looks like in New York State. We got this in 2009, we got this little infestation in Randolph, and then 2010 we came down here into Hudson Valley, and all of a sudden, oops, it was a big infestation, probably been there for many years, 10 years or so. We found 2 bugs in a trap, and there was about 60 square miles of infested trees that we found. Since that time, it's been expanding, and expanding quite rapidly. Then we found it up here in Monroe County. It's getting larger in Erie County. But the interesting thing is that now when we find infestations, we find them in a little bug in a trap. It's a very small thing, like the one out here in Rensselaer County. Dan was just telling me we really haven't seen any infested trees there yet. We caught it in the trap, but no infested trees. And I think that's probably where we are in the state right now as far as detection goes, where the big ones we've already got, but we're going to find continually these small infestations popping up where here in Nichols, we finally found some dead trees down there. We felled the trees and peeled them and found them. Actually, in Pembroke, we have yet to find any infested trees. We've got a bug in a trap. A couple there. Unadilla is showing. So these new infestations are just very, very small. And I wanted to emphasize the fact that, it's like, okay, so people carry firewood around. It's probably the best way to carry it and to spread it. It's why we have the firewood regulations. But the thing about the emerald ash borer, it takes a while for the populations to get going. It's like when it gets introduced into an area, you get a bug, it'll attack a tree, but it doesn't kill the tree. It'll kill just a small area of the bark. It takes a lot of them to kill the tree. And so by the time the populations develop to the levels where they can actually kill trees, it could be years. And indeed, I've actually dissected trees that have been infested for 7 years, and they still had green leaves on them. So it's like it takes a long time for the populations to develop. We're going to be finding these small spots. We're not going to find any dead trees, but it's important to know where they are so that we can focus our efforts, our attention to these areas. And indeed, there will be more spots showing up. So as far as detection goes, it's once again at the very early stages of an infestation, it's very, very difficult to find the emerald ash borer, but it's really important to find it at those early stages because we have far more options available in management if we know we're at the very beginning of an infestation. One important thing about emerald ash borer is it will not attack just one tree in an area. If you got one tree with symptoms, it's not emerald ash borer. It's going to be a whole area of trees. They're going to be attacking all around in there. It's one of the problems we have in New York State is that we have a lot of white ash. White ash does not like wet soils, okay? And so if you're a farmer, which is the first field you're going to let go back into woods? The wet one, right? And so we have a problem with white ash seeding into wet fields. They grow to a certain size, and then for some reason they decide that they're not liking it very much, and they succumb to some biotic or abiotic disease, and they start to decline. So there's one of the most important things, one of the most common things I get is that, emerald ash borer is everywhere in New York State. It's because people are seeing these trees going through decline without really knowing what the signs and symptoms are. Very important to know what the signs and symptoms are. You got to use multiple symptoms in the diagnosis, and I've already talked about that part. So, what are the visual signs and symptoms? The woodpeckers are my favorite, but basically you got to think about it varying with pest pressure. And pest pressure is very simply the number of bugs in one place at one point in time. But in early infestations, you get bark splitting and woodpecker foraging. Mid-level infestations, woodpecker foraging, canopy thinning starts to show up, and epicormic sprouting. By the time you see canopy thinning, you have one heck of an infestation going. It's been there for years already. And then a heavy infestation, canopy thinning, it's everywhere. Woodpecker foraging, I'll show you some pictures. And then epicormic sprouting, which is basically little sprouts coming off the stem of the tree. So bark splitting is is the earliest sign that you'll get. Basically, remember I mentioned you get one bug, it'll attack a tree, it'll kill the bark about the size of your hand, and then the tree is still perfectly healthy, it's still growing. That dead area of bark, then the next year when the tree grows, it'll split a little bit, it'll split a little bit more. And here you can see, right in here, there's a little gallery in there, and the gallery in there. If you can catch it at this point, you're walking on water pretty much. It's very, very difficult to see this. But when you cut through, I've peeled away the bark on this, you cut through and here it is. This is the original infestation right here. And the tree had grown, the tree had grown 5 years over that infestation, and it still has beautiful, healthy phloem tissue. That's the problem. It'll get into a tree, it'll get into an area, and it'll just be very light infestation, but all that time the populations are growing. So by the time you get a population that's actually killing trees, it's been there for years and years and years. I mean, who knows how many, 10 years maybe, 7 years? A long time. This is, here you can see the old infestation here, and there where the population's built up, it finally finished off the tree. Woodpeckering is what we use for detection, or for delimitation right now. It's very easy to see. Woodpeckers are our friends. Here they are. You can see where they pluck off the bark and they actually reach in and grab the larvae. This is an old place where the bark was flecked off, and you can see it's grayed, it's already oxidized. when you're looking for emerald ash borer, you've got to look for the nice, fresh, brown bark because it's not going to have time to get gray. By the time the populations build and you see general foraging like this, the tree's going to be dead very, very soon, and it's not going, these aren't going to have a chance to gray up. But always look for where it's reached in and grab the larvae. Remember I said when the populations get really heavy, they can actually just strip all the bark off. This is a tree down by Ruby in the Hudson Valley, and the bark is about a foot thick at the base of that tree. The populations are very, very high in this area. You see it's not just the random peck here or peck there. They've stripped the whole thing. This is more random. This is up in Monroe County. You can see that checkerboard pattern. Here you can see where it's stripped just areas around that tree. Again, this is a tree actually that was interesting that was in down there by Ruby in Ulster County. And I remember when we first found the infestation down there, it was just 2 bugs on a trap. Then we looked around 60 square miles. I remember looking at this particular tree in this little wet spot earlier in the year, and there was no indication that there were any emerald ash borer there. And I went back in fall, and they had already stripped off that much bark. It's pretty remarkable how quickly they operate, but I think there is a learning curve as far as they're learning to forage on them. But this is how we delimit the infestations now. We walk around or we drive around and we can see areas where the woodpeckers have been operating. So when you see those on the map back there, all the black spots, that's where we've detected the emerald ash borer. Here you go. This is actually foraging on the native red-headed ash borer. The native red-headed ash borer actually goes for weakened tissue. And so it'll oftentimes, like if a car hits a tree, the tissue above it will become susceptible. It can't get into the stronger tissue. And so you see the woodpeckering will be all in a line like that. Whereas the emerald ash borer, it's much more dispersed. Here's the epicormic sprouting. In urban areas where there are no woodpeckers, epicormic sprouting actually can be a good sign to look for. Here's the epicormic sprouting on a white ash, not as vigorous as on the green ash, but here you already see woodpeckering in this tree. Crown thinning. This is a very good character if you already have an infestation that's well developed. The thing about canopy thinning, it's not really it's not the lack of leaves, it's the fact that when the leaves come out, they're smaller because the photosynthates have been reduced because of the beetle feeding in the phloem, in the inner bark. And so when the leaves come out, they're smaller. You can see here, small leaves there. The leaves here are looking pretty good, but there you can see the leaves are a lot smaller. Here's a good sign right here. The leaves are very small up at the top of the tree. And this one is just in the very beginning stages of canopy thinning. You can look at it as a gradient from 0 up to 10. This is Dave Smitley's work. You can see the gradual canopy thinning. It's important to pay attention to canopy thinning when you're thinking in an urban situation as far as deciding when to treat your tree. If you have a tree where the canopy is already deteriorated, you know that there are a lot of bugs in that tree. And so it's really difficult, I think, according to a lot of the arborists I've talked to. If you got a tree that's more than 50% canopy decline, it's really not worth trying to treat that tree. Although a couple that I've spoken with have actually, they say it's a miracle, but they've done it. This is a tree, has nice big canopy on it, but this is what it looks like here. All of the phloem is totally dead in that tree. So that's why you see the canopy is declined. You'd say that's probably 80%. But there's no phloem left in that tree. It's all dead. So the real problem, I think, with the emerald ash borer is what we refer to as the death curve. And this is a regular sigmoidal population growth curve. Here you see the populations build, and then they go crazy until you get all the trees dead. The problem with the emerald ash borer is that by the time anybody really pays attention to it, there's already a significant portion of the trees dead. But then you only have a few more years before they're all dead. And that's really been the brunt of the problem throughout the Midwest. And what we have to pay attention to here as well is that if you plan ahead, down here you have time. At the very beginning, that's where it's really important for early detection. Because once it gets to here, you have very little time, and it's going to cost a lot of money. So I want to help you think about populations of emerald ash borer and how they behave. And there are two basic factors you've got to consider: pest pressure and host tree density. Pest pressure is very simple. It's the number of bugs in one place at one point in time. So you get very different responses of the population if you have just a couple bugs or if you have a whole bunch. Like, remember the picture of the woodpecker on that one tree. That was a big population, lots of bugs all at once. Okay, it determines how quickly a tree will be killed. You get lots of emerald ash borer, trees will be killed in 2-3 years, maybe even faster. But you get very few or very low, death can take a long time. Like I said, I've just dissected trees that have been infested for 7 years, and they still had perfectly green canopies. Low pest pressure takes a long time for the populations to develop to where you got the high pest pressure and you see tree death. It also determines the rate of spread in infestation. You get lots of AAB out there, lots of emerald ash borer. You're going to find the populations, a bug comes out of a tree, it's going to look for a place to lay its eggs. If there's no trees available because they're all dead, they're going to go. And they're very strong flyers. They can travel very quickly. But if you got very few, the emerald ash borer will come out, it'll find food right nearby, and it'll lay its eggs nearby. So the population, the spread is not very quick. Although we do feel that there are certain portions of the population that really are, it makes sense. A certain portion of the population, they come out and they just want to go. And so that's how perhaps spot infestations start. You get an adventurous individual out there that just wants to disperse. Host tree density also makes a difference. It determines the rate of population buildup and the rate of spread and infestation. You get high ash density, you have lots of food in one place, the populations can build rapidly. And this happens right now. There are a couple of places where I'm expecting to see the green cloud emerge because they're in areas where it's like 100% ash and wetlands up in the Ontario plain. Low ash density, interestingly enough, population spread could actually be enhanced by low ash density because they'll come out and there's no ash around, so they'll go find an ash tree. And I think that's what's happening in the Ulster County area. Populations are actually moving faster in the Ulster County infestation than they are any other place that I've seen it in New York State. Pest pressure also impacts management decisions. Pest detection is very difficult at low pest pressure, but it's like if you can find it when it's at the very lowest levels, you have a lot more options available to you. Timing of management decisions, the earlier the better. And I'm going to emphasize the use of the EAB cost calculator at Purdue University. If you haven't heard about it and you're involved in any kind of municipal decision making, it's a very wonderful tool to be using. And pesticide effectiveness varies with pest pressure as well. Only really the best only the best pesticides work when you have a high pest pressure situation. But one of the problems that we're dealing with now in the state that emerald ash borer is not everywhere, and people are unnecessarily treating their trees. So it's very important to know where it is and when to treat. These are the areas primarily around the state that are infested. Here we have Ulster County. Here you see the number of ash in this area is very small, but you get up here in the Ontario plain, we're looking at up 20% or higher of the basal area in the forests is ash. It's going to be a very different situation up here than it is down in this area here. When you look at it like this, you got all these circles around here. Those are the areas that really, if you want to treat your trees, we should be thinking about it. Okay? If you look at the Hudson Valley, this is the large infestation in Ulster County. This is the one just south of Albany in the Bethlehem area. Here we have detections and traps, but we have yet to find any infested trees. You have a lot of time in these areas, to make your plans. But when you're in the middle of this area, in the Ulster County area, you don't. This is the Bethlehem area here. This is looking at it more closely. Really, the mortality in this area is centered around here right now, but these are where we have detections. Remember the woodpeckers? This is where the detections are. So it's probably well beyond this area here. And if you're anywhere near there, you should be very seriously considering treating your trees if you want to save them. Ulster County population, this is the area where we have the detections. This is where the woodpeckers are. It's probably beyond that. really the mortality is centered right around in the Woodstock Ruby area. And you're going to be hearing more about that later on in the presentation. And at the periphery, you can really, there's very little indication that emerald ash borer is there right now. But that's why it's important to look at the woodpecks and know where it is. This is looking at it more closely. It's the Ruby, Woodstock area. This is where we're really seeing a lot of mortality now. So really, the rubber hits the road, I think, with the emerald ash borer when you're thinking about economics and in the communities. This is an excellent study put out recently in 2011. And I think there are some very important points. The first one is that the costs are largely borne by homeowners and municipal governments. Looking at the trees in people's yards and the ones around buildings and infrastructure. The sobering thing is that the wood and foam-boring insects are anticipated to cause annually $1.7 billion in local government expenditures. But really, the one to pay attention to that really troubles me is that given observations at new species, they feel that there's a 32%, not 31, not 33, I always give them a problem with that, but 32% chance that another highly destructive borer species will invade the US in the next 10 years. Isn't that a nice thought? But they're there. And I think the thing about the emerald ash borer is that it's told us basically to pay attention, and that's what we're doing now. It's really changed the forest entomology as a profession. This is just a breakdown of the costs. Here you can see local government expenditures, household expenditures, residential property value loss. I mean, that's huge right there. The forest landowner timber loss is minuscule compared to the outlay that the communities and individuals, homeowners, are going to be facing. So just to think about what's at stake, I just walked around Ithaca, around my neighborhood, and took pictures of the trees that I could see. This huge green ash, beautiful tree, over 3 foot in diameter. Power lines is a wonderful thing to think about when you got ash trees. After all, ash is an early successional species, and when you have infrastructure like power lines and whatever, you have a disturbed area. The trees that are going to seed in there most readily around the power lines are going to be ash, not really the oaks. It's the ash that are going to be there. We are really vulnerable in that respect. This poor fellow, I mean, you can see 2 trees there. It's actually 5 trees leaning over his house. This is a neighbor right across the street. She's on a fixed income. She's got 4 ash trees about 2 foot in diameter right next to her house in the back. And I've felled a lot of trees, but you wouldn't catch me anywhere near that one. So, just to think about it, I got together with my friend Brian Skinner, and we put together some numbers about just thinking about the power transmission lines in New York State. And the total number of transmission lines is about 110,000 miles. But really, only about 106,000 are vulnerable to trees falling on them. And if you look at some of the figures that we came out with, they estimate 242 trees per mile along the lines. It makes for 26 million total trees. A conservative estimate is that 20% are ash. That makes 5 million ash trees. And a conservative estimate of tree removal is $300 per tree. That makes the ratepayers responsible for about $1.5 billion just to maintain the power infrastructure, the power transmission lines. That's not lines going to people's houses. That's not lines along, those little country lanes that we have so many of in New York State. That's a big number, and it's probably going to be a lot larger. And especially when you consider that this is with planning ahead. When reactive, we know that what happens, we see the bucket trucks coming up from Georgia whenever we have the big, huge ice storms. That's very expensive, much more expensive than this. So, I've been thinking about this for a while, and really, I've been talking about emerald ash borer, and I have my objectives. And my objectives, there's 2. Restore all the ash species to the North American landscape, and to help mitigate the economic impacts of the emerald ash borer. It's not very ambitious, right? But really, it's the way I keep saying, because that is what I'm here for. I want to see ash back on the landscape. Is it a short-term proposition? Absolutely not. In all reality, we could lose a very significant portion of the ash in North America. It's very likely, unless we start acting now. I have a 3-point plan. And really, this is what's necessary to restore ash. We need biological control in place. Biological control are predators and parasitoids. that eat the individuals. And it's like natural populations are kept in balance by two things: biological controls and host tree resistance. We have none of that with the ash trees right now. But we need to establish biocontrol now, as soon as possible, so that it spreads across the landscape. We got to get biological control out there. Identify and incorporate resistance, that's a long-term proposition. Think about it. You got a little tiny tree, it's going to have a different kind of resistance than a huge tree. It takes a long time to really evaluate whether or not you have a resistance in the genes of the tree. So it's a long-term project, and I tell you, we got some really good people working on it now. We've got really good tools, and I'm looking forward to perhaps the location of resistant individuals or the breeding of resistance into the genome. And we have to conserve the ash genome across the landscape. I think it's really important. There's seed collection, but also preserving, I think, magnificent individuals through insecticidal treatments is good. Biological control. Okay, there's basically 3 parasitoids that we've been working with from Asia, an egg parasitoid and larval parasitoids. There's another one from Russia. It's almost approved, but not yet. And they've been releasing them on the landscape. And I tell you, it's like anybody can grow fruit flies, right? You ought to try and grow these things. It's really difficult. I did that in graduate school for 5 years. My populations kept going to males. I couldn't get the females. It's really difficult. But we got a really fantastic magician, basically, out in Michigan working on these now, and they're pumping out thousands. And we've been releasing them in New York and around the whole area. And I think it's really important that we get support to continue supporting this effort so we get them spread across the landscape. That's one of the most important aspects. We got to get biological control in place. Well, there's native biological control. There's species that we've collected, but they just aren't numerous enough at this point in time. And woodpeckers are there as well. So, when you consider biological control, it's actually an additive thing. It's like the woodpeckers take out so much, and this bug will take out so much, and that bug will take out so much. So gradually you get a level of control that'll keep the populations from going epidemic. That's what happens in a natural situation. So it's very important for the long term to get biological control in place. Resistance, they've been trying a lot of things, crosses with Asian species, but not all of them cross. They're making back crosses. The one that's actually very interesting, and the one that I think we really should be paying more attention to, is what's happening in the Midwest is that the emerald ash borer goes through an area and there'll be a couple trees left. It's like, are those trees really resistant? And they think that actually that they might be. And so they're looking at it right now to be sure that they are resistant, but we have to be able to identify those trees. So when it comes through our area, pay attention to those trees that remain. And then, of course, collecting seed. There's a federal, regional, and state programs underway, and indeed there's one by New York City Parks that's just getting underway, and they're connecting up with the task forces and hopefully we'll get a much larger effort of seed collection within the state. And I'm very supportive of preserving magnificent individuals across the landscape. You put seed in the deep freeze, it's one thing, but keeping live trees out there, I think, is a very important part of the mix as well to preserve the genome. And mitigating the economic impacts, proactive planning, I can't stress that enough, engaging communities, and then developing novel management techniques. Basically, proactive planning is just, it's critical. And we're going to talk about that, and I'm not going to walk all over the speakers that are going to be talking later. But basically, I think getting local task forces, participating in the local task force is really important because it's a place where people can go, the information is good, and you can determine local needs and priorities. And I think very importantly is to foster intermunicipal cooperation. There are a number of projects that have been initiated between municipalities and other places where we have the infestation going right now. I don't really have time to go into all of them, but like sharing resources for tree treatments and for marshalling yards. I mean, tub grinders. You imagine how much material we're going to have after all these ash die? It's huge. Wood utilization is a big part of the mix. And boy, a tub grinder is an expensive thing to have around, but it's very useful when you got a lot of material. And also engaging local volunteers. There's nothing worse than giving a talk and seeing people that are enthusiastic and saying, oh, well, go home, you know the signs and symptoms, give me a call when you see it. You have a task force, they can get engaged and become a valuable part of the mix. So these are the task forces we have in the state, and actually there's more that are forming. I'd like to focus on Onondaga County because they actually were operational for about 3 years, and then all of a sudden this summer they got emerald ash borer, and I tell you, it was magnificent. They had all the information, they knew exactly what they were going to do, they knew where the ash trees are, and boom, 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 boom. It was a textbook example. Other places more have it's like they're playing catch up, but I tell you, it's made a difference. Especially in Erie County, Monroe County, they've got marshalling yards set up. They're really doing a good job. There's all sorts of projects. I think actually identification of local expert resources is a really important one. Everybody says, well, what am I going to do? Well, you know, I want to save my trees, where can I go? To have those local resources identified is really important. Get the volunteers going, and the intermunicipal cooperation is so important. So what are the management options? Doing nothing, that's really great. Liability issues are something to consider. When trees fall, they don't always fall where you want them to. Remove ash before they become infested. It's a very expensive proposition. And I'll show you some data here that shows that it's not actually the best option. Remove them as they become infested. Once again, it's an expensive reactive management. Remember the death curve. When they start dying, all of a sudden you get a whole lot of dead trees all at once. It's very expensive. Or you can treat with insecticides to retain the canopy. These are the insecticides that are out there. Imidaclopirid's been shown to work, but really the one that everybody's using now is emamectin benzoate. Imidacloprid is very common. It's inexpensive, but it's really it doesn't really work at the very, very highest pest pressures. I'm not convinced of it yet. Dinotefuran safari is also registered in New York State. Dinotefuran is a very fast acting. It's a basal bark application. It gets in the tree really quickly, but it doesn't seem to work when you get late instar larvae in there. So you know, it's really good. It's very effective, very quick, but really the emamectin benzoate is the one that I recommend the most. And the most important thing is that it's demonstrated that it's actually effective for up to 3 years. The label says 2 years, but it's really, they're showing up to 3 years effectiveness with this product. And that could be really important when you consider management options and such. Pesticide use strategies. Communities are using insecticide treatment to spread out tree removals according to their schedule, not the bug schedule, basically flattening out the death curve. Many communities in the Midwest now are switching to treating all of their street trees to retain the canopy. And one of the interesting things to think about is that insecticides, mostly when you think about it, you get them into the tree and they're in the phloem tissue where the bugs are eating, but they're also effective on the adults when they're feeding on leaves. And so it's important to consider that in the mix with treatment. And actually, there's a very interesting study done by Deb McCullough and Rodrigo Mercader. This is just a model. And of course, models, they always have their problems, but it's an important thing to think about. This really got me going. The model, basically, this is the death curve right here, and it looks pretty much like the death curve that we see in nature. But they're looking at using emamectin benzoate and treating just 10% of the trees every year. After 10 years, they still have a very significant number of trees remaining in the area. But if the model treats just 20% of the trees, at the end of 10 years, you have almost all your trees alive. And that's because the emamectin benzoate gets into the leaves of the tree, and the females go to feed on the tree, and they eat a bite of the leaf, and they die. Okay, so that's where this model does. And if you think about it, okay, so this is at year 0, you have all your trees. You treat 20% of the trees in year 1. Okay, so a bug comes into the stand and it's going to feed on a leaf, right? If it feeds on one of these trees that are treated, it'll die. If it feeds on the others, it'll be okay. But the chances are there that it's going to feed on one of those. After year 2, the chances are even greater that it's going to feed on a poison tree. And if you consider the 3-year efficacy of the pesticide, after 3 years, the chances of it feeding on poisoned leaves are actually pretty darn good. Year 4, some of the effectiveness comes out, but here you still maintain about 60% of the trees with poisoned canopy. And year 5, it's the same thing. That doesn't really wash out with a lot of people when you think about, oh, my trees, I just don't want to take any chances at all. So I'm proposing the 33% solution, which basically you treat a third of your trees every year. And pretty soon, after 3 years, all your canopy is poisoned. Now, this could be really useful in places where you have parks. I can think of one right now in Onondaga County. They have a park at the most popular park in Onondaga County, has about 8,000 ash trees, and it is pretty much the only tree in that park. They're considering doing this to preserve the canopy in that park. And you know, the costs are actually very reasonable compared to others. And that's why I mentioned the Emerald Ash Borer cost calculator created by Cliff Sadoff. It's at eabindiana.info. I really recommend looking at this tool. It's fantastic. You can get in there, you can put in, change the data the way you want it to go. And you can compare different options. But the thing is, you look at the different options, proactive removal, boom, you're all done. You take down all the trees and you're done with it. This is just a fictitious a city here. Whereas you replace them as they die, your costs go way up, and then you're done with it. But if you do the urban slam model, treating just 20% of your trees, the costs, cumulative costs, are very low over the total 25-year span. But you got to consider the benefits of urban trees. Landscaping value, energy savings, water interception, business activity, and human health. Human health is the one that everybody thinks about. Yeah, trees feel good. I just this study just came out, and it's absolutely phenomenal. And it deals with emerald ash borer being taken out in the Midwest. And this really is one of the best studies that I've ever seen that looks at the loss of ash trees in the Midwest. And the results suggest that loss of trees to the emerald ash borer have increased mortality related to cardiovascular and lower respiratory tract illness. And I've never seen a study like that before. Maybe you have, Jim. But anyway, this was a big impact on me, and big impact, I think, to retain good reason to retain the urban canopy. And if you look at the urban slam model, after 25 years, you have much more of your canopy than if you take them out or you let them die. So what can you do now as a homeowner or a community member? I think number one, you got to know your liabilities. You got to know what ash you have, so you can also prioritize your management decisions. Explore management options. The Emerald Ash Borer Cost Calculator, I can't stress enough, is a valuable tool. And know where EAB is. You can go to the maps on our website, nyis.info. They're the DEC-produced maps. They're great. You can go to the DEC website as well. They're there. But also, I think it's so important to participate in the local task force so communities can get together, pool their resources. And I'm going to finish with that.